Today we are talking about one of the oldest cold case murders in the U.S. to be presumably solved. We are discussing the disappearance and murder of Maria Ridulph. Maria was born on March 12, 1950, to Michael and Frances Ivy Ridulph. She was the youngest of 4 children. She had 2 sisters and 1 brother. She disappeared on December 3, 1957, at 7 years old from Sycamore, Illinois. Her remains were found almost 5 months later in a wooded area near Woodbine, Illinois, which is around 90 miles from her hometown. On December 3, 1957, Maria had begged her parents to go outside and play with her friend Kathy Sigmund in the first snowfall of the season. Maria and Kathy both lived on a side street named Archie Place. So after dinner, Maria and Kathy went outside in the dark and played a game they called Duck the Cars, which isn't as bad as it sounds. They ran back and forth trying to avoid the headlight beams from passing cars in the street. According to Kathy, the girls were approached by a man who she described as a man in his early 20s and tall with a slender chin, light hair, and a gap in his teeth. Kathy told the police officers that the man said his name was Johnny. He was 24 years old and had asked them if they liked baby dolls and piggyback rides. Maria ran back home to get a baby doll to show Johnny. When she returned with her baby doll, Johnny gave her a piggyback ride. Kathy ran back home to get her mittens because it was cold outside. When she returned, Maria was gone, and so was Johnny. Kathy went to Maria's house hoping to find her there, but she was not. The Ridulph family initially thought that Maria was just hiding. Maria's 11-year-old brother Charles went out looking for her. When he couldn't find her, the family called the police. Within an hour, police and armed civilians began searching the town for Maria, but could not find any trace of her or the man that Kathy said was named Johnny. The FBI, thinking that Maria could have been abducted across state lines, arrived in Sycamore within 2 days to help the local and state police in the search for Maria. Numerous people were interviewed that stated they had seen the girls playing at the intersection of Center Cross Street and Archie Place at what they thought was between 6 and 6:30 that night. They all stated that they did not see anyone else with them. The family members that had seen Maria get her doll and Kathy her mittens were interviewed as well. Through the interviews, the police believed that Johnny had approached the girls after 6:30 and Maria was abducted between 6:45 and 7 p.m. Since Kathy was the only witness that had seen Johnny, she was put into protective custody, as the police were afraid the kidnapper would return for her. The police had Kathy look at photos of convicted felons or suspects who the authorities felt might bear a resemblance to the man named Johnny. Kathy was not able to identify any of the photos as the man whom she had seen that night. Maria's disappearance received national news coverage. Both President Dwight Eisenhower and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had regular debriefings of the case's development. The police continued to investigate Maria's disappearance. They interviewed known sex offenders, transients, and locals, but did not develop any what they thought were solid leads. Maria's parents appeared on TV and other media pleading for their daughter's safe return. On April 26, 1958, near Woodbine, Illinois, about 90 miles from Maria's home in Sycamore, 2 tourists were searching for mushrooms in a wooded area along U.S. Route 20. What they discovered left them scarred for life. They found the remains of a small child. The only clothing on their remains were a shirt, undershirt, and socks. By the condition of the body, it was believed to have been there for several months. Coroner James Furlong did not allow any photos to be taken of the scene or remains because he did not want photos of the child's body to be leaked to media outlets. The child's remains were identified as Maria Ridulph from dental records and by the clothing. Since the crime did not cross state lines, the FBI withdrew from the case, leaving it to the local and state police. The police had no solid leads, but there were a few suspects in the case. One was John Tessier. John was born John Cherry on November 27, 1939 in Belfast, Northern Ireland to British Sergeant Samuel Cherry and his wife, Eileen McCullough Cherry. Samuel Cherry was killed in World War II. During the war, Eileen Cherry served as one of the first female airplane spotters with the UK's Royal Air Force. This is where she met Ralph Tessier at Bovingdon, England, as he was serving with the United States 8th Army Air Force. Ralph and Eileen were married on November of 1944, and after the war, they moved with John to Sycamore, Illinois. Ralph and Eileen had 6 more children together over the years. After his mother married Ralph, John used the last name Tessier. The Tessier house was just around the corner from the Ridulph house. The Tessier house was visited as part of the neighborhood search for Maria on December 4th, 1957. Kathleen and Janine Tessier later said that their mother told the police that John had been home on the night of December 3rd, which they knew to not be true. Shortly before Maria's body was found, the FBI investigated John Tessier as a possible suspect. Sources differ on what brought John Tessier to the FBI's interest, but some believe it was John Tessier's parents seeking to clear their son's name that drew attention to him. Tessier and his parents told the FBI that he was in Rockford, Illinois on December 3, 1957, to enlist in the Air Force. He said he had been in Chicago December 2nd and 3rd undergoing physical examinations for his enlistment. John told the investigators that on the morning of December 3rd, he had visited the Chicago recruiting station and then went sightseeing around Chicago. Then he returned to Rockford by train that evening, supposedly arriving around 6:45 p.m. When he arrived, he stated that he called his parents for a ride home to Sycamore. Telephone records were later found to show a collect call was placed from Rockford Post Office to the Tessier home at 6:57 p.m. that evening. John met with officers from the Rockford recruiting station to drop off paperwork relating to his enlistment. The officers confirmed that they spoke with Tessier around 7:15 that evening, but one officer did express some concerns about Tessier's credibility and conduct. The FBI investigators had John take a lie detector test, which he passed. Since John seemed to have an alibi and had passed the lie detector test, he was taken off the suspect list on December 10, 1957. Kathy was never shown a photo of him to see if she could identify him. John left Sycamore the next day to report for basic training at Lackland Air Force Base. John Tessier served in the U.S. military for 13 years and rose to the rank of captain. Once he left the military, he moved to Seattle, Washington, where he graduated from the King County Law Enforcement Agency in June 1974. He became a police officer in Lacey, near Olympia. Later, he joined the police department in Milton, Washington. John and the police chief of Milton did not get along. The chief had a long list of complaints about Tessier, listing things about his work and also about his conduct. In 1982, Tessier took in a 15-year-old runaway in Tacoma, Washington, named Michelle Wyman, who knew him as a Milton police officer. Wyman later testified that Tessier had fondled her and performed inappropriate acts on her shortly after she began living with him. Tessier was charged with a felony but negotiated it down to a misdemeanor. He was sentenced to 1 year probation and was fired from the police department on March 10, 1982. John Tessier legally changed his last name to McCullough on April 27, 1994, saying he was honoring his late mother. Another suspect the police looked at was William Redmond. He was a truck driver and carnival worker from Nebraska. In 1997, Sycamore Police Lieutenant Patrick Soler closed the then 40-year-old Ridulph case by naming William Redmond as the man who had likely abducted and killed Maria. Redmond was charged with the 1951 murder of an 8-year-old from Pennsylvania in 1988. That case was dismissed, though, when a police officer refused to reveal the name of his confidential informant. Redmond was a suspect in the 1951 disappearance of 10-year-old Beverly Potts from Ohio. According to Lieutenant Solar, Redmond told a fellow inmate that he had committed a crime very similar to Maria's abduction and murder. Redmond couldn't defend himself against the allegations because he passed away in 1992. Solar's report was criticized due to a lack of supporting evidence, and Solar himself acknowledged the evidence against Redmond was circumstantial. So Solar called Maria's case closed, but not solved, leaving the possibility open that a better suspect could be found later. Maria's case was finally reopened in 2008 based on new information from McCullough's half-sister Janet Tessier. According to Janet, their mother Eileen had said John did it, those two little girls and the one that disappeared. John did it, on her deathbed in January 1994. Janet took her mother to mean her brother had killed Maria Ridulph. She had also heard from her two older sisters, Catherine and Janine, that their mother had lied to investigators about John being home that night of Maria's disappearance. John's sisters had believed him responsible for Maria's death for years. Janet stated that she tried several times over the next 14 years after her mother's death to get law enforcement, including the Sycamore Police and the FBI, to look back into her brother. Lieutenant Solar was part of the Sycamore Police during this time, but had identified William Redmond as the most likely suspect. He stated that Janet had never spoken to him, but he would not have suspected John Tessier, now John McCullough, because he knew the Tessier family. Ralph, the father, had painted the Sycamore police cars, and John had been cleared by the FBI in 1957. In 2008, Janet emailed an Illinois State Police tip line, which resulted in the State Police Cold Case Unit undertaking a lengthy investigation into McCullough's alibi and into his background. The Tessier sisters told the investigators about their suspicions and how John had inappropriate contact with Janine when she was a child. Another woman alleged that John had given her a piggyback ride when she was a child and had refused to put her down until her dad had stepped in and handled the situation. The state police reviewed evidence and were able to develop a new timeline in which McCullough could have kidnapped Maria and driven to Rockford in time to make a phone call at 6:57 p.m. and meet with recruiting officers at 7:15 that night. In this new timeline, they determined that Maria would have been kidnapped no later than 6:20 p.m. The police search for Maria was underway by 7 p.m. according to Catherine Tessier. She had returned home from a party at 7 to find the search in progress. The state police were hoping to have Kathy Sigmund Chapman review a photo lineup to see if she could identify John McCullough. They took 5 photos from the 1957 Sycamore High School yearbook, but John had been expelled from school, so they couldn't pull his picture from the yearbook. They were able to get a similar photo of John from a former girlfriend, but it differed from the yearbook photos in that McCullough had an open collar instead of a suit, and the background was a little darker. Along with the picture, McCullough's old girlfriend also gave them an unused military-issued train ticket from Rockford to Chicago, dated December 1957. The police took this to suggest that, contrary to McCullough's alibi, he did not take the train on his trip to Chicago, which suggested that he could have been driving the whole day. Kathy was shown the photo lineup the police had assembled, and she picked out the photo of John as Johnny from the night of Maria's disappearance. In July of 2011, the Seattle Police Department, who had joined in the Illinois State Police investigation, brought John McCullough in for questioning. John cooperated at first, but when asked about the murder of Maria Ridulph and his whereabouts on the night of her disappearance, he became aggressive and tried to be evasive. When he refused to answer any more questions, he was arrested for the abduction and murder of Maria Ridulph and was extradited back to Illinois. Maria's body was exhumed in July 2011 to examine for DNA evidence. None was found. A forensics anthropologist found that Maria had been stabbed in the throat no less than 3 times by a long, sharp blade. The trial was in September 2012. The prosecution contended that McCullough was attracted to Maria, but ended up causing her to being unalive, and presented the new autopsy report. There were numerous witnesses that testified against John. Some of Maria's family, neighbors, Kathy Sigmund, and another childhood friend both testified that John McCullough was Johnny that liked to give piggyback rides. On September 14, 2012, McCullough was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridulph. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 20 years. John was 73 years old when he was sentenced. John appealed his convictions. On February 13, 2015, the Illinois 2nd District Court upheld his murder conviction, but vacated his convictions for kidnapping and abduction. This decision had no effect on John's life sentence. McCullough filed a petition for post-conviction relief, asking for his murder conviction to be set aside in 2015. At first, it was dismissed until his old public defender helped him to file a successful motion that could not be denied without a hearing from the state attorney's office. The county's state attorney, Richard Schumack, conducted an extensive review of the evidence in the case and came to the conclusion that McCullough could not have committed the crime. His main reasoning was the collect call made to the Tessier resident from Rockford on the night of Maria's abduction, stating that Rockford and Sycamore were 40 miles apart and McCullough could not have been in Sycamore at the time of Maria's abduction. On April 15, 2016, Judge William Brady of the Illinois Circuit Court vacated McCullough's original conviction and sentence and ordered a new trial. McCullough was still charged with the crime, but was released on bond pending a new trial. A week later, Judge Brady dismissed the charges against McCullough, but the dismissal of the murder charge was without prejudice, but he could be tried again for Maria's case. Judge Brady postponed ruling on a request by Maria's brother Charles, backed by hundreds of signatures from Sycamore citizens, that a special prosecutor be appointed to replace Schumack on the case. Judge Brady denied the motion for a special prosecutor on August 5, 2016. Charles Ridulph then stated he would not appeal the ruling. McCullough was denied innocent of the crime by the County Circuit Court on April 12, 2017. So will the world ever know what truly happened to little Maria Ridulph? Did John have a hand in her disappearance that night? Was William Redmond involved somehow? We may never have the answers to our questions about little Maria. Let's hope that one day Maria's family can find some kind of closure from this whole ordeal.